The school bell rang, marking the end of another busy day at Brookfield Elementary. Students flooded out of classrooms, their laughter and chatter echoing through the hallways. Teachers packed up their things, ready to head home, and parents waited impatiently outside to pick up their children. In the midst of this daily routine, no one paid much attention to the quiet figure mopping the floors near the entrance, Daniel Carter, the school janitor. Daniel had been working at Brookfield Elementary for over 10 years. A man in his mid-50s, his hair had begun to gray, and his hands, rough from years of hard work, told a silent story of resilience. He was the kind of person who rarely stood out, blending into the background as he went about his duties. Yet, those who took the time to notice him knew that Daniel was more than just a janitor. He was a kind soul who always had a warm smile and a helping hand for anyone who needed it. "Have a good evening, Mr. Carter," a teacher called as she walked past. "You too, Mississippi Lane," Daniel replied, tipping his cap slightly before returning to his work. As the hallways emptied, Daniel sighed and leaned on his mop for a moment. His shift wasn't over yet. He still had to check the classrooms, clean the cafeteria, and lock up. It was a routine he had followed for years, but he didn't mind. His job might not have been glamorous, but he found joy in the small moments, like the thank you notes some students left for him, or the way the younger kids smiled when he fixed something they thought was broken forever. Little did Daniel know, that night was going to be different. A moment was approaching that would not only challenge him but change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Daniel finished wiping down the last few desks in one of the second-grade classrooms. The school was nearly silent now, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. He glanced at his watch, 6:45 p.m. Almost time to do his final rounds before locking up for the night. He walked down the dimly lit hallway, his footsteps echoing softly. The school always had a different feel after hours, peaceful yet eerily quiet. Daniel didn't mind. In fact, he found a strange comfort in it. As he turned a corner near the library, something unexpected caught his eye. A small figure sitting on the floor near the lockers. Daniel frowned. The school was supposed to be empty by now. He took a cautious step forward, and that's when he saw him. A little boy, no older than 6 or 7, hugging his knees, his small frame trembling slightly. Daniel's heart tightened. He recognized the look on the child's face. Fear, confusion, and loneliness. He had seen that look before, in his own reflection many years ago. He approached slowly, kneeling down to the boy's level. "Hey there, buddy," he said gently. "Are you okay?" The child sniffled and wiped his nose on the sleeve of his tiny blue jacket. His eyes, wide with worry, met Daniel's. I don't know where my dad is," the boy stammered. His voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded understandingly. "It's all right, kiddo. We'll find him, I promise. What's your name?" The boy hesitated before answering. "Oliver." "Nice to meet you, Oliver. My name's Mr. Carter. I work here at the school," Daniel said with a warm smile. "How about we go to the office and call your dad?" Oliver hesitated, gripping his backpack tightly. What if he's gone? What if he forgot about me? Daniel's chest ached at the worry in the boy's voice. "No way," he assured him. "Sometimes parents run a little late, but no dad would ever forget about his kid. Let's go find out together, okay?" After a moment, Oliver nodded. Daniel held out his hand, and the boy hesitantly took it. Together, they walked toward the main office, Daniel making sure to keep his pace slow so Oliver wouldn't feel rushed. When they reached the front desk, Daniel picked up the office phone and dialed the number listed in the emergency contact book. He put the call on speaker so Oliver could hear. After 3 rings, a frantic voice answered. "Hello? This is James Parker." "Mr. Parker, this is Daniel Carter from Brookfield Elementary. I have your son, Oliver, with me. He's safe, but I think he got a little lost." A heavy sigh of relief came through the phone. "Oh, thank God. I was caught in traffic and my phone died. I just got home and realized Oliver wasn't with his usual after-school group. I'm on my way right now." Daniel glanced at Oliver, who looked slightly more relaxed. "He's coming to get you, kiddo," he said with a reassuring smile. Oliver exhaled slowly and nodded. While they waited, Daniel grabbed a juice box from the teacher's lounge and handed it to Oliver. "Here, kid. It's apple, my favorite. Oliver took it and murmured, "Thank you." Daniel ruffled his hair. "No problem, buddy." 15 minutes later, a tall man in a suit burst through the doors, his face full of panic, until his eyes landed on Oliver. "Oliver!" James Parker rushed forward, dropping to his knees as he hugged his son tightly. "I'm so sorry, buddy. I didn't mean to be late." Oliver clung to his father, his small hands gripping his jacket. "I thought you forgot about me." James shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "Never. Not in a million years." He looked up at Daniel, gratitude evident in his eyes. "You have no idea how much this means to me." "Thank you, Mr. Carter." Daniel gave a small nod, just doing what anyone would. But as James helped his son gather his things and they walked out together, he knew deep down that not everyone would have done what Daniel did. The next morning, Daniel arrived at Brookfield Elementary as usual, slipping through the side entrance before most of the staff and students arrived. He followed his routine, checking the hallways, wiping down the cafeteria tables, and ensuring the classrooms were ready for the day. But something felt different. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy from last night, Oliver. The way he had been sitting there, so small and frightened, haunted him. Daniel had always had a soft spot for kids, but something about Oliver tugged at his heartstrings in a way he couldn't explain. As the school day started, Daniel resumed his usual duties, expecting the memory to fade. But a few hours later, as he wheeled his mop bucket down the hallway, he heard a familiar voice. "Mr. Carter." Daniel turned to see Oliver running toward him, his backpack bouncing on his small shoulders. The boy stopped a few feet away, beaming. Daniel smiled. "Hey, kiddo. You doing okay today?" Oliver nodded eagerly. "Yeah. My dad made me pancakes this morning, and he said he's gonna pick me up early today." "That's great," Daniel said, genuinely happy for the boy. "Sounds like you have a good dad." Oliver's face lit up with pride. "He's the best." But his expression turned a little shy. "I wanted to see you, to say thank you for last night." Daniel chuckled. "You don't have to thank me, buddy. I'm just glad you're safe." Oliver fidgeted for a moment before digging into his backpack. "I made you something," he said, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "It's a drawing." Daniel carefully took the paper and unfolded it. Inside was a crayon drawing of a tall man in a blue janitor's uniform standing next to a small boy with messy brown hair. Above them, in big, uneven letters, were the words, "My hero." Daniel stared at it for a moment, his throat suddenly tight. He'd received little notes and thank yous from students before, but this was different. He swallowed the lump in his throat and forced himself to speak. "This is amazing, Oliver. I love it." The boy grinned, rocking on his heels. "You can keep it forever." Daniel chuckled. "I just might." Just then, the classroom door behind them opened, and Oliver's teacher stepped out. "Oliver, time for class," she said kindly. "Okay." Oliver turned back to Daniel and waved. "Bye, Mr. Carter." Daniel waved back, watching as Oliver disappeared into the classroom. He looked down at the drawing again, smiling to himself. Carefully, he folded it back up and slipped it into his pocket. As the days passed, Oliver made a habit of finding Daniel throughout the school. Whenever he had a break, he would run up to chat or help Daniel with small tasks like carrying a broom or handing him paper towels. At first, Daniel thought it was just a phase. Kids often got attached to certain adults at school. But Oliver's visits never stopped. And strangely, Daniel found himself looking forward to them. One afternoon, as Daniel was fixing a leaky faucet in the boys' restroom, Oliver appeared in the doorway. "What you doing?" the boy asked, tilting his head. "Just stopping this sink from flooding the school," Daniel joked. Oliver giggled. "Can I help?" Daniel hesitated before nodding. "Hold the flashlight for me, buddy." Oliver eagerly took the small flashlight from Daniel's toolbox and shined it where Daniel pointed. As they worked, Oliver suddenly asked, "Mr. Carter, do you have kids?" Daniel froze for a second before resuming his work. "No, I don't." "Why not?" Oliver asked, genuinely curious. Daniel sighed. It was a question he hadn't been asked in a long time. It just never happened, I guess. Oliver considered that for a moment before saying, "You'd be a really good dad." Daniel stopped turning the wrench, Something in Oliver's voice, his innocence, his certainty, made Daniel's heart ache. He swallowed and forced a smile. "Thanks, kid." They finished fixing the sink, and Oliver gave Daniel a high five before running off to class. That night, Daniel sat in his small apartment, holding Oliver's drawing in his hands. His mind drifted to his younger days, to the life he had once dreamed of. A family, a son of his own. But life had turned out differently. And yet, for the first time in years, he wondered, maybe it wasn't too late for something to change. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel and Oliver's bond continued to grow. It became a routine. Oliver would find Daniel during recess or after school, sharing stories about his day, asking endless questions about Daniel's work, and sometimes just sitting nearby while Daniel cleaned. Daniel had never had someone look up to him before, not in the way Oliver did. It felt nice, but at the same time, it scared him. He wasn't used to being important in someone's life. One evening, as Daniel was locking up the janitor's closet, he heard voices in the hallway. "Why can't I stay longer?" Oliver's small voice echoed down the corridor. "Because I said so, Oliver," a man's voice replied, firm but not unkind. Daniel turned the corner to see Oliver standing with a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit. His father, Daniel assumed. "But I didn't get to say bye to Mr. Carter," Oliver protested. His father sighed. "You'll see him tomorrow. Let's go." Before Oliver could argue, Daniel stepped forward. "Hey, Oliver." The boy turned, his face lighting up. "Mr. Carter." Oliver's father followed his gaze, his expression shifting to curiosity. He was in his late 30s, with sharp blue eyes and an air of authority that suggested he wasn't used to being questioned. "You must be Mr. Carter," he said, stepping forward. "I'm James Reynolds, Oliver's father." Daniel wiped his hand on his work pants before shaking James's outstretched hand. His grip was strong, controlled. "Nice to meet you," Daniel said. James glanced at Oliver. "He talks about you a lot." Daniel chuckled. "I hope only good things." James didn't laugh, but there was a small hint of a smile. "He says you helped him when he got lost a few weeks ago." Daniel nodded. "Just did what anyone would do." James studied him for a moment before speaking again. "Oliver's taken quite a liking to you." Daniel wasn't sure how to respond to that. He didn't want to overstep, but he also couldn't deny that he had grown fond of Oliver, too. "He's a great kid," Daniel finally said. James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, he is." His expression darkened slightly, as if he wanted to say more but held back. Then, he cleared his throat. "Anyway, we should get going." Oliver looked disappointed, but didn't argue this time. He waved at Daniel. "Bye, Mr. Carter." Daniel smiled. "See you tomorrow, buddy." As they walked away, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to James Reynolds than met the eye. A few days later, Daniel was finishing up in the cafeteria when the school principal, Mrs. Holloway, approached him. "Daniel," she said, her tone hesitant, "can I speak with you for a moment?" Daniel wiped his hands on a rack. "Of course." She gestured for him to follow her into her office. Once inside, she sat behind her desk, folding her hands. "I received an interesting request," she began. "From Oliver Reynolds's father." Daniel's brow furrowed. "James." Mrs. Holloway nodded. "He wants to meet with you." Daniel frowned. "Why?" He didn't say exactly, but he was insistent. She studied him for a moment. "Do you have any idea what this might be about?" Daniel hesitated. "Not really." She sighed. "I have to admit, this is unusual. But Mr. Reynolds is a significant donor to the school, so I agreed to arrange the meeting." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "When does he want to meet?" "Tomorrow evening. At his office." Daniel swallowed. He wasn't sure what James Reynolds wanted from him, but something told him this wasn't just a casual chat. The next evening, Daniel found himself standing outside Reynolds Enterprises, a towering glass building in the heart of the city. He adjusted his shirt, feeling out of place among the polished professionals walking in and out of the lobby. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The receptionist led him to James's office on the top floor. When Daniel entered, James was seated behind a massive desk, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. "Mr. Carter," James greeted, standing up and extending a hand. Daniel shook it, then took the seat James gestured to. James sat back down, exhaling slowly. I appreciate you coming. Daniel nodded. Not sure what this is about, but I figured I'd find out soon enough. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. I'll get straight to the point. He hesitated before continuing. Oliver lost his mother when he was 3. Daniel's stomach tightened. He barely remembers her, James continued. And I've done my best to raise him. But with my work, it's been difficult. Daniel remained silent, letting James speak. I've hired nannies, tutors, caregivers, James said, rubbing his temple, but none of them connected with him. And then, out of nowhere, he starts talking about you. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. At first, I thought it was just a phase, James admitted. But it's been weeks, and Oliver still talks about you constantly. He let out a small, humorless chuckle. Do you know how rare that is for him? Daniel shook his head. James sighed. I won't beat around the bush. Oliver trusts you. He looks up to you. And for the first time in a long time, I see him genuinely happy. Daniel's heart pounded. I appreciate that, but I'm just a janitor, Mr. Reynolds. James met his gaze. Maybe to everyone else, but not to Oliver. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He had never been anyone's first choice before, never been needed in a way that truly mattered. James leaned back in his chair. I don't know what you're doing differently, but whatever it is, it's working. And I can't ignore that. He hesitated before adding, so, I have a proposition. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What kind of proposition? James took a deep breath. I want to offer you a position, not as a janitor, but as Oliver's mentor. Someone who can be there for him when I can't. Daniel stared at him, stunned. You're serious? Dead serious, James said. It's not a formal job. There's no contract. Just be there for him. Spend time with him. Help him navigate life. Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't something he had ever expected. For so long, he had been stuck in the same routine, convinced that his life had settled into place, permanently. But now, for the first time in years, it felt like there was a door opening in front of him. A door to something new, something bigger than himself, something that, deep down, he had always wanted. After a long pause, Daniel finally spoke. I don't know if I'm the right guy for this, he admitted. I don't have experience raising kids. I barely have my own life figured out. James gave a small, knowing smile. Neither do I. Daniel let out a quiet laugh. James leaned forward again. Just think about it, Daniel. No pressure. But I have a feeling Oliver would love it if you said yes. Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind swirling with emotions. Maybe this was crazy. Maybe he was completely unqualified. But maybe, just maybe, this was exactly where he was meant to be. That night, Daniel lay awake in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling. James's offer echoed in his mind. Be there for Oliver. It sounded so simple, yet it carried a weight he wasn't sure he could bear. Could he really step into that role? He was just a janitor, a guy who barely scraped by each month. What did he have to offer a child like Oliver, whose father was a billionaire? Doubt crept in, telling him he wasn't good enough, that he'd just mess it up. But then, he thought about Oliver's smile when they talked. The way the boy sought him out every day. The way he had clung to Daniel's hand that day in the hallway, trusting him completely. He sighed, rubbing his face. He had never been someone's first choice before. Never had anyone rely on him in a way that truly mattered. For once, maybe it was time to stop doubting himself. The next morning, he found himself dialing James's number. I'll do it, he said as soon as James answered. There was a pause on the other end, then a relieved exhale. Thank you, Daniel. You have no idea how much this means. The transition wasn't easy. At first, Daniel wasn't sure what his role really was. He wasn't a teacher, or a nanny, or a counselor. He was just Daniel. But to Oliver, that was enough. Their time together started informally. After school, instead of heading straight home, Oliver would sit with Daniel while he cleaned. They'd talk about everything: books, superheroes, space, what Oliver wanted to be when he grew up. Slowly, Daniel became more involved in Oliver's life. James arranged for them to spend weekends together, sometimes at the park, sometimes at a museum. They even built a birdhouse for Oliver's backyard one afternoon, covered in messy paint and laughter. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something he hadn't in a long time: purpose. But not everything was easy. James's house, pushing his fork around absent-mindedly. "What's up, buddy?" Daniel asked. Oliver hesitated before looking up. "Are you gonna leave?" Daniel blinked. "What?" Oliver lowered his head. "People always leave." The words hit Daniel hard. He realized then that Oliver wasn't just looking for a mentor. He was afraid of losing someone else he cared about. Daniel took a deep breath. "I'm not going anywhere, Oliver." The boy searched his face for any sign of dishonesty. "Promise?" Daniel nodded. "Promise." Oliver's shoulders relaxed slightly, but Daniel knew the fear wasn't gone. And that scared him, because for the first time, someone depended on him to stay. That night, Daniel sat on James's back porch, staring at the city skyline. James joined him, handing him a beer. "He asked if I was going to leave," Daniel said after a moment. James sighed. "I figured he might." Daniel glanced at him. "How do I make him believe me?" James took a sip of his drink before answering. "Just keep showing up." Daniel nodded. He could do that, because, for the first time in his life, he finally had something worth staying for. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel became a constant presence in Oliver's life. Every day after school, Oliver would rush to find him. Sometimes, they'd do homework together in the janitor's office, surrounded by mops and cleaning supplies. Other times, they'd sit on the school steps and talk until James arrived. On weekends, they explored the city, visited science museums, and played basketball in the park. But something even more surprising happened. Daniel started believing in himself. For the first time in years, he felt needed. He felt valued. He felt like he was making a difference. And he was. One afternoon, as Daniel finished mopping the halls, Principal Evans approached him. "Daniel," she said, her voice unusually warm. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" He nodded, setting the mop aside. "Of course." She led him to her office, gesturing for him to sit. Taking a deep breath, she smiled. "I've been watching you these past few months, and I have to say, I'm impressed." Daniel blinked. "Impressed?" She nodded. "Not just with your work, but with how you've helped Oliver. That boy was struggling, and now he's thriving. His teachers have noticed a difference. His father has, too." Daniel shifted in his chair, unsure of where this was going. "That's why," Principal Evans continued, "I wanted to offer you a new position." His breath caught. "A new position?" She slid a folder across the desk. "We have an opening for a student mentor. It's a full-time role working with kids who need guidance, students like Oliver. I think you'd be perfect for it." Daniel stared at the folder, his heart pounding. A real job, a chance to do something that mattered. "But I don't have a degree. I'm just a janitor," he said hesitantly. Principal Evans smiled. "You're more than that, Daniel. You've already proven that. And if you want to pursue further education, we're willing to help with that, too." Daniel swallowed hard, emotions overwhelming him. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a second chance, a new beginning. That evening, as Daniel sat with Oliver at the park, he couldn't stop smiling. "What's up with you?" Oliver asked, raising an eyebrow. Daniel chuckled. "I got a new job today." Oliver's eyes widened. "Really? Doing what?" "Helping kids. Kind of like how I've been helping you." Oliver grinned. "That's awesome. Does that mean you'll still be around?" Daniel ruffled the boy's hair. "Yeah, buddy. I'm not going anywhere." Oliver beamed, and for the first time, Daniel truly believed his own words. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was someone who made a difference. And that changed everything. Final reflection. As Daniel walked home that night, he thought about how much had changed in just a few weeks. He had gone from being an invisible janitor to someone who mattered. Someone who had changed a child's life, and in doing so, had changed his own. He had spent years thinking he wasn't good enough, that he was destined for a life of struggle. But all it took was one moment of kindness, helping a lost child, to set his life on a different path. Sometimes, life doesn't change in grand, dramatic ways. Sometimes, it's the smallest actions, the smallest choices, that lead to the biggest transformations. And Daniel had learned that lesson firsthand. As he stepped onto his front porch, he took a deep breath, feeling something he hadn't in years: hope.